Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us on our rescheduled but very special Thursday ThreatCast. My name is Chris Michaels. I am the Director of Communications here at SimSpace. I'm very proud that you are joining us for a special edition here with Matt Johnson, who is our Director of IT Security, or our acting CISO here at SimSpace. Matt, thank you for joining us for this chat today.
Yeah, no problem.
Matt, you come from a pretty extensive background of having to mitigate a lot of threats and looking at pretty extensive technology stacks. Tell us a little bit about your background and what brings you here to SimSpace.
So my background started in the DoD, like a lot of people in the security field, working various different programs and projects and incidents within the DoD, and then it spawned into state government. I helped stand up the SOC for the state of Colorado. That was kind of an interesting experience, obviously coming from federal to state, a lot of different things there. But at the same time, one of the coolest things about that was there was a huge attack threshold there. They were constantly under attack, under the gun by some of the largest APTs in the world. So got a lot of experience outside of kind of having a full realm of support you get with the DoD, kind of, a one-man show, two-man show, three-man show type of deal against some large-scale attackers. And then did this for commercial, large-scale commercial, Fortune, 200s and below companies. And then now I'm here at SimSpace, kind of doing it here / working with the product team and the advancement of our stack of what we offer here at SimSpace. But kind of seen a lot of it, seen different technology stacks, seen different attacks, different things like that, done hundreds of incidents. So just kind of running the gun here and doing these things. So.
Well, we're really proud to have you. So first of all, thank you for joining the company. Thank you for joining us today. Given your extensive expertise to both federal and state level government agencies, as well as working with many of the Fortune, I figured it would be great to have you on really to talk about some of the recent news and breaches that have happened. This time, specifically looking at some of the factors around MFA, or multifactor authentication. For the folks who are joining us, can you tell us a little bit, overarching theory, philosophy of what MFA is, and how it should be incorporated in an organization?
Yeah, so I mean, MFA is a pretty standard practice, I think, now in most organizations, whether you're large or you're small. MFA is essentially something. It's a double check, right? For lack of better terms, it's a way of saying this is who I am and this is something about me or something I use, right? So you'll see a lot of people, they'll have a app on their phone, right? That says, hey, I'm logging in, I use my password, and then it's going to prompt me to either hit submit or type in an RSA style token or something like that that's usually tied to an email, a phone, something like that. And it's kind of a good practice whether you're with a company or you're just your personal email, right? Like Google offers it for Gmail for just personal use, right? And I think a lot of email providers do now. It's just a good practice, right? It kind of cuts down on the potential attack or potential misuse of someone's account. If they were to get the hash of their password, then they could get in. But with the MFA in place, right, that adds another layer that challenges them. So that's what's really interesting about this recent attack is obviously it's going after that second piece, which is the MFA piece, which kind of opens the door, if it gets compromised, to a whole host of issues.
And the recent attack that we're talking about specifically, and really it might not even be called an attack so much as it's social engineering to bypass their way into it. But the Okta incident that happened recently. And one thing in our discussions beforehand, you even said that this is almost like a supply chain attack in the way that it was carried out.
Yeah. So, I mean, the rule of thumb lately in the cyber field is that they're going to go after, I hate to call it third parties, but they're going to go after third parties, right? The easiest way to get to the groups that you want to attack, right? The companies that have the financial benefits that these attackers are looking at. The easiest way is to go after the tool sources, right? So whether that's something like Okta, or it's a MSP that they're using, a managed service provider, or it's another tool, right? We've all seen it. We've seen it with like SolarWinds. We've seen it with some other stuff. The goal there is obviously maybe not directly attack the companies, but attack the tools or the resources that they're using in order to get their foot in the door. And the tools is a big, interesting one because, most attack groups are, they're strategic in what they're attacking, but they're also opportunistic. So take an Okta, right? If you get in and compromise an Okta, now it opens up a host of their customer base, right? So very opportunistic in a way. So that way they're not just attacking one group or one company, they're attacking now hundreds and thousands of companies potentially.
Right. And
as we really saw with SolarWinds, a couple
right.
years ago.
Right. And this isn't unique to just Okta, right?
No.
I think many years ago, there was the RSA had their algorithm cracked.
Yep. So you see it with RSA. The big one you see a lot is MSPs, right? They go after the managed service providers, and then it's a gateway into a company, right? So if I'm a managed service provider and I got 20 customers, right, and I get compromised, that attacker just gained 20 attacks surfaces to go after, right? Take like an Okta or RSA or SolarWinds right now, that goes even higher, right? Hundreds, thousands potentially.
Well, especially when a lot of the MFA, you have FEDRAMP rules in place, right?
Right. So there's a lot of these compliance rules, FedRAMP obviously being a huge one on the federal side. There's rules around it with SOC 2 and some others, and HIPAA even has some very specific rules depending on if you have that sort of data in your environment. And they do go after kind of trying to protect these things and requiring that you have these things. So MFA is a requirement by all of those for compliance purposes. So now your groups that you're required to have it, right, have this very, very important data, for lack of better terms. And they're going after those groups, which typically data is money 99.9% of the time. So to me, it's just something that we're going to see almost on a, monthly basis, if not more rapidly than that. It might not be MFA this week, it might be something else. But either way, especially as compliance dictates that we have these tools and have these processes, right, that puts them more and more in the crosshair. So,
right. Well, and I think the part that interests me is also it's novel to go after the tool, but it's also the way in which people are gaining the access, right? So in the case of Okta, it was a third-party support person who had their credentials exposed, and then that person got access to the portal. Then you also have, there's the man in the middle authentication capturing that's happening occasionally. There's also, a recent article that I read that hackers were using a modified MFA tool against the Indian government employees. So essentially created an MFA false app that people were using there in India.
right,
and stealing that token right away because they controlled the token.
And you're going to continue to see these kind of creative methods. And then you're going to see some kind of old school methods. Like I know Tesla had one a few months back, right, where they just went after an employee of interest and decided to write them a check to get inside the door because their security posture was such a state that it was almost not advantageous financially for them to go try to figure out a way in. It was easier just to pay somebody off, right? The problem is that person came forward and said, hey, they tried to pay me, and then, it didn't work. But you're going to see, in my opinion, like just some of these attacks you're going to see coming out and the attack methods they use to gain entry are probably going to make people shake their heads a lot because it's no longer the brute force, the simple brute force at the door, right? It's no longer just I got them to click on a phishing email. They're very, becoming very skilled at designing ways to attack you and then using those methods against you. So take, the Indian one, like that's something that we've seen on different scales, right? It's kind of falsifying something that they use, but we hadn't really seen it for MFA, right? Like we hadn't seen it at that scale. So it might not be a new thought process, but maybe it's a new application.
So with people targeting MFA, since MFA is one of the tool sets, the second step of privileged access,
Right.
can we have inherent confidence in the principle and use of MFA?
So this is the strategy, right? Like MFA is still a necessary evil. I still am 100% supportive of MFA and MFA products, whether it's Okta or someone else, right? But I think you have to tie it back to, it's not your only tool to secure you, right? It's not your only tool to manage privileged access, right? You need to have a defense in depth strategy that goes into understanding kind of your holistic environment and how you would manage that. You know, I think more and more and more, you're going to see people really start focusing in on defense in depth, because you can see an EDR get broken, right? People can bypass the best EDRs on the planet. We see it every day, just about. MFA right now, right? So they get in, they get privileged access. Well, if you know anything about incident response, getting privileged access is like, that's the keys to the kingdom, right? So from there, depending on the account that you're getting access to and you're using, kind of opens you up for a levy of different things you can conduct. And those things are, depending on the environment, right? So depending on how you're set up, what's your infrastructure, what you're using. So the biggest thing for me is to kind of advise anyone is have that defense in depth strategy in place. And then the second big piece of that is not just having the defense in depth strategy in place, but having a way to look at it. A lot of people buy point solutions, right? Their defense in depth strategy is, I got this and I got that and I got this, and they got 20 different tools, right? But they actually have no way of looking at them or pulling them all together or correlating the data or alerting.
Or knowing how they work in concert with one another, right?
Right. And I mean, I don't care where I've been. I've walked in and there's a lot of point solutions in place, and they don't all talk together. They don't all work together, and then they don't all alert together. Sometimes they fight each other, depending on the tool suites. And it makes it really hard for an analyst to decipher, okay, did someone's MFA just get popped, right? Did someone, account get privileged access? Did someone elevate their account, right? All of those different things, that sometimes you might want to know. Like I walked into an incident once and I was helping out, basically ended up leading the incident. And the first thing I asked for is, give me the last group of accounts that have been escalated in the last 2 weeks. And they came forward and there was 3 accounts. And I said, okay, focus on those 3 people. And they're like, why? And I'm like, because most likely they were easily phished or something. They got access, let's take a look at their structure. And they didn't really have a defense in depth strategy. They didn't even have an MFA in place on those accounts. It was, they got in, they escalated their privileges. The next thing you know, the attacker was running free and wild in the environment. And so I think you really, when people are starting to look at security, they need to look at it like an onion, right? And just one layer at a time. And then, kind of couple that with what their risk appetite is and what their budget is, right? Because those are always going to be, like if you go to the DoD, right? They have a 0 risk appetite. They're taking no risk, but they also have the budget to match it. So, you go to a small company, they might have a 0 risk appetite, but they don't have the budget to match it. So they have to meet somewhere in the middle. And I think a lot of people need to start strategically planning their security solutions based off of what their environment is. If they're a heavy cloud shop, right, they need to plan it off of that. But they also need to take a lot of things into consideration when they're doing that. A lot of people just jump headfirst in and then turn around and they're stuck in a contract they can't get out of, or it's not really working for their environment because they didn't think of all these other intangibles. And it's a pain, but it puts more emphasis around the PMing / management side of security, which in my opinion has probably not gotten the representation it needs.
Right.
I always, as a director of security or a CISO or as a SOC manager, I always kind of do all those hats. And it's like, sometimes it is, and then you're strategically planning and playing with the budget and playing with the resources. And there's a whole lot of different things that come into play. But take like an MFA breakdown, as I like to call it with Okta, right? if you had a really good defense in depth strategy, you would notice some of the malicious activity going on in your network, right?
Right.
It wouldn't stop at just, oh, they got past MFA, we're done. It would be, you'd be able to kind of trigger some alerts and correlate that information correctly to be able to kind of focus in on who's violated or what was violated. So in this case, Okta, right? And you can say, oh, our MFA is, at a very vulnerable state right now. We need to put in some different checks and balances in place.
So one question I have is if we don't have a proper defense in depth strategy, really, what would the impact of an MFA breach be? I mean, it seems like
catastrophic, catastrophic, right?
Yeah.
Like, so let's just say you get on my machine and, you bypass my MFA, and I had essentially all the keys to the kingdom, right? Like, let's say I'm a domain admin, right? From there, an attacker could carry out essentially a host of different, attacks, right? They could do your standard ransomware attack, which might not be very complex, but it can be very catastrophic. They could build a back door and start, funneling data out the back door and then kind of collect the residuals from that. Or, there's a lot of, they could sit quietly. They could install various different other ransomwares or malware, sorry, and conduct whatever it is that they're after, depending on your organization. So if you're an organization that has very strategic IP, right? Like, let's say you're working on a very strategic project and the IP is the most important thing, right? Now they just gain access to that. And you'll see based off of that, right? What the attack group might be. So take an Okta compromise, right? A lot of people think it's just that group that's going after you. Well, that group's in the business of making money, right? It's easier to sell that intel to, a different group or different country or different whatever, and let them carry out the attack of their choice, and you just collect the money, right?
Right.
We've seen a lot of commodity malwares, right? They just sell them.
Or as ransomware or malware as a service,
right?
The people that are actually it's now an affiliate structure. I'm going to make it. I'm going to sell it to as many groups that want to use it, and I'm just going to rake a percentage of how much you collect on the dark web.
And it reduces their risk, right?
Right.
So, if you're a service provider, let's say, and you're in a country that has extradition to other countries, your risk is higher, because if you get caught, then it's you could be on the line. Now, if you're just selling the product or selling the access or selling the compromise, right, then your risk goes strategic to that. It's the same thing with us managing risk on a commercial basis. They're managing risk and calculating profit and trying to figure out how much investment they're going to make. And that's the other thing, like these attack groups have a huge budget sometimes, right? And they're not just, one lab in a basement in St. Petersburg, Russia. Sometimes it's, thousands of labs scattered all over the world, and they each have their own little piece of the pie that they're doing. Like, I mean, some of the stuff that we saw last summer with the Conti group kind of exposed the structure of some of these large scale groups.
Especially when a lot of the people working for it think that they're a legitimate company, and they're just creating all the software that they need to create.
Right. Like they had no idea that what they were doing was the back end for something that could, be catastrophic for other companies.
Right.
They just thought they had a contract and they were doing what they needed to do based under the terms of the contract. They had no idea that they were doing it for an e-crime syndicate.
Right. So if my MFA goes down, or some, either the solution provider ends up getting breached, or internally I find that there's a breach of my MFA, either individual person or the overall solution is at that point not trusted. I guess what are the challenges in how we react and respond?
So, I mean, the number one thing, right? Like a lot of people will do, and it's kind of the number one methodology still to this day, right? Is change everybody's passwords, right? Immediately go in, make everybody force change their password. Well, that could and could not work, right? So, like if you have a compromise where they actually have, the user's email or something on top of the MFA compromise, right? Then you're kind of playing whack-a-mole, right? So the challenge becomes making a strategy that you can live with. Let's say you're an organization with 100,000 employees. Rotating passwords for 100,000 people could be catastrophic on resources, could be catastrophic just on management. There's no telling how much bad code has been written that you're using in your environment that requires a password that now has to go back and be updated.
Right.
I think the focus for me anyways is always to try to limit what could be catastrophic from an infrastructure or management perspective. So focusing on those privileged accounts, making sure that they're managed better or more tightly, or you're monitoring them.
Right.
Making sure you're not doing any conducting any changes, right? Like you put in a change freeze for the next week or two, whatever it is for you to figure it out. I always, you want to react quickly, right? Like you always do, but a lot of times I see people overreact. Like I've seen it where, oh, we came in and we're trying to help them close out an incident and they changed everyone's passwords. Well, that was the first thing they did. And while that was fantastic, they still had an active compromise, right?
Right.
So like all they did was change everybody's passwords and the attackers just got the new password. So thanks, or the attackers changed it to whatever they wanted, right? So like, let's say if they owned a host. So you kind of want to limit what can be done in the environment. So no changes, control those privileged accounts, put in those kind of freezes, and then start your real investigation on what's the level of compromise that we have and what should we be doing to fix it. So like take MFA, right? You at that point, right, you're pulling in Okta to be like, okay, what are we doing here? I put in a change freeze. No one can do anything in our environment. We basically halted our business operations, for lack of better terms, but we're still functioning, right?
Right.
But Okta needs you to come in as the provider and tell me, hey, when can I shore this up? And because sometimes in a situation like MFA, right, it's not typically in your hands to fix that. It might be that you have to go to a different solution on the fly, which we all know is a disaster, but it has to happen. Like some cases, maybe not with MFA, but sometimes you'll see it. Like I know with SolarWinds, right? The gut reaction from everyone, including the federal government, was rip it out.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of had this like, oh crap, like we're losing all our network visibility for, until we can get something else in here. But based off of the information we had at the time, it was a better solution than just sitting back and watching. So.
Right. And at the same time, you put the patch in place, and the patch itself might actually make the problem worse.
And that's my thing, like with all of these major level incidents, right, is you have to keep in mind that every day it's going to change for the next umpteen weeks, right? So take Log4Shell. Like I was almost laughing at companies coming out saying, oh, we're good within like a day or two. And then a week later, it's like, no, we lied to you. We're not that good,
Right.
And it was kind of like, yeah, duh. Like, like, and you see these people, they jump the gun to say they're good, or you see companies jump the gun to try to make the fix immediately without actually understanding what the fix might be 2 weeks from now, right? I mean, we saw it with SolarWinds, right? They threw out a patch and the patch was compromised essentially, right? So while people were jumping to try to do the right thing, right? Like the unfortunate thing is Intel is slow relative to the attack, right? So
Right.
it's sometimes will hurt you more to react quickly.
So you mentioned a couple of times managing the accounts that have privilege, or the amount of privilege that people have. Does that mean that you would advocate, pushing to do zero trust everyone?
I would. And I don't. So let me rewind that. I would push to zero trust based off of your risk appetite. So if you're a giant commercial company, I wholeheartedly would tell you to go to zero trust. I would tell you to go to some form of platform where you could look at zero trust, and then you could look at all the data across the platform and be able to react on data that's correlating, right? Whether that's just a simple SIM, or you're using like a true cloud solution that's hosting in like an XDR style, right? Where you're bringing everything together. And then laying that over with the zero trust kind of methodology. So that way, you're kind of, your defense in depth strategy is, I don't trust anyone, right? If you're a small company, right, a zero trust solution is probably overkill and financially not viable, right? So at that point, it's limit the things you can limit locally, right? So get rid of admins on your boxes, right? No one needs to be an admin unless they absolutely have to be, right? And then what you want to do is simple things like, let's say I limit down my admins to 5 guys in a company of 200 people, right? Great. Now I'm gonna track those 5 accounts, and I'm gonna monitor the use and activity of those 5 accounts. And I'm gonna build some rules in my SIM that say, okay, those guys work 9 to 5, right? I want alerts anytime something happens after 7 p.m. with their accounts, right? Because now I have a kind of a risk, right? And to be able to do that, I know it's like a very like, oh, that's really simple and that's easy, and we can build some signatures that do that in our SIM, or we have a tool that can do that, or whatever it may be. But simple things like that, especially for small companies, even though it's not technically zero trust, right? You're still not trusting the accounts. You're still monitoring and checking those privileged accounts. And then if you get to the point where you can, afford like a PAM or afford a zero trust model where you're going to put in the full suite, I mean, then great. But a lot of companies can't. But if you're a big company, your risk is so much larger based off the volume of accounts, volume of people, production, right? Like let's say you're Ford Motor Company, right? Like, now that you're getting chips in, right? Like the last thing you want to do is stop getting the cars out, right? So the hardest thing for you to, suffer through right now would be some form of attack that would bring you down, and all your factories are down, and here you are sitting on a couple $100 million of assets that you need to get out on the street. So and that's where I think a lot of people in the security industry get so caught up in like the malware, or the ransomware, where they only wanted, $500,000. I'm like, yeah, but how long were you down for?
Right. What's the long-term impact to your business?
Right.
Right.
Like I'd go into incidents and I'd say, okay, what's your daily dose, right? What does it cost you per day to be down? And you'll be shocked. Some companies can't answer that question, even Fortune 500s. They're like, huh? Right. And other companies that can, when you get that number, you're like, whoa, like you're down $100 million if we don't get you up and running by Friday.
Yeah.
Oh, like that's
And what's your risk appetite, right? Because that goes right to the risk manager and the risk officer to sit there and say, this is our daily burn. How much are we willing to interrupt operations if that's going to be the end all be all of our success?
And I think this is to go back to the management side of security, right? This is a perfect exercise. So take the MFA compromise at Okta, right? Now you play it out. So you say, okay, I'm the SOC manager for whatever, XYZ Corp. And if this were to affect us, go to the risk officer and say, we'd be down for, let's just say 3 days, right? 3 days at the short, 2 weeks at the long. What's our daily dose, right? So now you actually change their risk appetite by exposing them to the fact that something as simple as a commodity issue, right? A software that they buy or whatever goes down, or they have an issue with it, like MFA, like Okta, it would cost us X amount of money per day slash, this many days. So let's say it's, $10 million, right? So, and you say the short is 3 days and the long is 7 days, right? So they go, so it's 30 to $70 million. And you're like, yeah. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it because it's a third party software we use. And because we don't have, zero trust in place, let's say, right? This is what you're going to lose potentially. Now it gets those risk officers to start really juggling it, because I always say in security, it comes down to the dollar, right? Follow the dollar. you'll figure out where you need to be. Same thing, right? A lot of people don't relate the money aspect to a company correctly. They say, I need this tool. All right, we need zero trust because we need it. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, has anyone done the math on if we don't have this and we have a compromise like an Okta, what it would cost us? And then when they start doing it, they're like, you know what? We could spend $1.5 million on some zero trust methodologies and tool sets and some people to put that in. And that will save us, potentially $70 million. Now they're like, oh, I like this defense in depth strategy, right? Like I can now justify this to the board of directors to say, go get, and it goes for small companies and big companies alike, right? But I think the failure in a lot of organizations is they can't relate that correctly. They don't take an incident like SolarWinds or, Okta or, Print Nightmare or Log4j and then roll up the downtime and the cost and then relate that back to a strategy, right? A lot of them, and then there's a lot of work there. You got to figure out a strategy. It's not just, hey, let's go buy this solution from this guy over here. Like, no, there's got to be a strategy behind it, but it's a risk reduction strategy at the end of the day, right? So
agreed. Well, so I've got one last question for you, which is really, if you were to name 3 takeaways, like 3 big takeaways about implementing MFA or the impacts of MFA to your business, what would those takeaways be today?
So, I mean, a big takeaway is don't let one compromise thwart you from using MFA, right? Like, don't lose faith in the methodology, right? MFA as a methodology is still very, very, prevalent. It's relevant. It's needed. Maybe you shop around more. I don't know, right? If you're using, like, I hate to say this, but if you're using a very well-known product, right, your risk goes up of that product being compromised, not because they're doing a bad job, just because more people are going to go after that product. Just simple as that. But don't lose faith, right? Like the MFA, I would say don't lose faith. The second one is, even if you're not affected by something like Okta, right? Even if Okta, you don't even have Okta. Let's say you have another MFA. Don't waste a good incident, right? Don't waste a good chance to go and reduce your risk. So, like I said, use the MFA incident for Okta and say, here's potentially what it could have done for us, right? And document that. You might not get money, you might not get personnel, you might not get a new tool, you might not get any of that stuff, right? But you document the risk in such a way that you're presenting it, whoever's leading the security operations teams, in a way that people understand, okay, here's a real life incident. While it didn't affect us, doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at it. I think too often you see these commodity issues come out where it's like, SolarWinds went down. Cool, we don't use it. It doesn't affect us. That is literally like the first thing they say, and they walk away. And I'm like, no. Like, it's SolarWinds this week, right? It's Okta next week, right? It's something else. So use someone else's incident to your advantage.
Should people use this as almost a tabletop exercise, or even maybe do a range exercise if that were appropriate?
And that would be like, that's a perfect segue, right? This is the benefit to something like a range, right? It might not have been Okta that you had at your company, but it's a perfect exercise to go in and do a range exercise, roll up your sleeves and figure out how you would defend against it. And if you could defend against it, does your stack allow you to defend against it? Does your principles and methodologies that you use allow you to defend against it? And then use that evidence, right? Like, too often I see people go in, they do a range exercise and they go, yeah, that was great. Use that evidence of how you did or how you didn't do, right? Or what you thought were shortcomings to kind of go back to whoever it is that holds the purse strings and explain to them the risk, right? And 9 times out of 10, right? Like, if you explain to them like, hey, Okta came out, you probably heard about it. Here's a 1-pager on it. We did a range exercise. And in that range exercise, we found out that, we probably could have experienced some pretty big downtimes, and to the tune of, a week, right? Based off of this. and the potential data loss would have been X, you know, and the man hours would have been Y, and here's the roll up, right? Because I hate to say it, right? Now you're exposing sort of your deficiencies, but at the same time you're learning from them. It's not just from you learning, but you're also teaching your organization the results from it, right? You can't defend against every attack, right? And that's the thing where people, you know, I don't know how many places I ran where they're like, what do you mean we're still compromised, or we got compromised? Like, you can't defend against everything. But the goal is to have a strategy to make it the shortest possible time of downtime, or, you know, like I always say, only get an inch deep, right? They can only get an inch deep because we did all these things, but you still got to roll that up to what can we do better? What can we learn from? And if there is changes in the you know, the company that we need to make, or costs, you know, centers that need to be increased, right? Then that's just more evidence that that SOC manager, that security director, that CISO uses to help drive his future state budgets, future state planning, and strategic outcomes. And like I said, take Okta, right? You might use something completely different, right? And you're like, well, it doesn't matter. Let's test against it. See how we do as an organization. Where can we learn from an analyst standpoint? Where can we learn from an incident response standpoint? And then where do we need to change our strategic planning? So,
yeah. And you can also compare a lot of those tools, right?
oh,
So
yeah,
being able to sit there and say, all right, I've got 4 different vendors. What one's going to work best in my stack, or within my organization, or within the types of, you know, I'm a regional bank. I've got all my individual branches that all connect together on one central hub and have to connect to the Swift system. So how do I make sure that all my, you know, to those layers of defense and privilege and zero trust, and that outside most layer being my MFA, right?
Oh, and I think that's a huge piece, right? Like, I'll wholeheartedly admit it, right? I've bought a lot of tools and immediately regretted my decision in the first 90 days, right? And I thought I did my homework, you know, right? Right. You know, well, and that's the thing. Like, I thought I did my homework. I thought, you know, I tested them. I did all this stuff, right? Like, you know, I was on top of the world. Like, this is the tool, right? And then 90 days later, I'm like, man, I messed up. Like, that is not the tool we needed, right? That doesn't do anything I thought it was going to do, or it affects us in this way, which is dwell time and downtime, or, you know, whatever it may be. And having the ability to like really, really test that as part of your strategy is just, it's irreplaceable, especially for, you know, organizations that want to get in. Like, I hate to say it, right? All the vendors want to give you a 3-year deal, right? They're going to crunch the numbers, make it right. They're going to change the billing cycle so that you're not taking it in the pants till, you know, Q4 of, you know, the second year or whatever it is, right? So you can kind of offboard some of the financial risk there. But the problem is, you know, you're in these deals for 3 years. A lot of times people they can't afford the 1-year deal. They go with 3-year deal. And next thing you know, 90 days in, they're going, great, I'm stuck with this. Or now I got to go to the CFO and beg and plead for money, which never goes well. Like, so having the ability to just say, hey, I'm gonna, you know, use an exercise. We're going to test all our tools. You know, it's going to cost us this much, but it's going to save us like God goobles of money, right? Or time. It's just invaluable, in my opinion.
Awesome. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So I'm going to say, you know, thank you very much for joining us. These are great insights. On top of which, you know, the last thing I want to leave us with is, at no point do we want to say MFA isn't a solution. In fact, it's probably one of the better ways of at least ensuring that people have the right privileged access right now. Correct?
Yeah, correct. I mean, and it's nothing against Okta. I mean, it could have been anyone, like I said. And the way they handled it, in my opinion, they did the best they could with what they had. So kudos to them. I'm still a huge proponent of MFA, whether it's for a company or your personal email, right? Like, I tell everyone, you know, hey, yeah, you know, you have a Gmail, congratulations, put Google Authenticator on your phone and set up 2-factor. And they just kind of look at me like, why? And I'm like, just do it. Like, you know, like 90% of your issues will go away, right? Yeah. And it's true, whether 90% of your issues will go away, but there's always that 10%. right? And in this case, you saw the compromise from the tool itself. There's a whole host of and litany of things that could happen.
Right.
But to me, the methodology of MFA is still loud and proud, in my opinion. It's still a necessary thing that people should be doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time. For those of you who have any questions, you're more than welcome to email us. Our customer success team is always standing by to answer questions for you. That email is just success@simspace.com. Again, be sure to subscribe to our Thursday ThreatCast as well as our Demo Tuesdays, as we go through a lot of the ways that you can use the cyber range to validate the technologies within your stack, validate your responses as well, and test your team and procedures to make sure that they are 100% accurate, refined, and that you can stand with confidence about your overall security. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. For Matt and myself, we'll see you guys next time.